Yo, what's going on, you guys? Your boy Ben Mahari here, represent Mahari Nation Sports Podcast. Much love to the entire LDBC and the entire boxing community. Um, Sadly, we lost one of our greatest, heroes in the sport of boxing today. Um, According to reports, Marvin Hagler passed away at the age of 66. Um, as of this moment, his wife said that there's no cause of death that's been determined at this time right now. You know what I'm saying? Although I did read some increments of reports that he may have died due to, complications from a COVID-19 vaccine, but I'm not going to, confirm that until it's actually been, been reported and been confirmed. So don't take my word for it. But this is not about that. But I just wanted to talk about, my view of Marvin Hagler and his career. You know, when we think about, you know, tragic, passings to great, figures in any profession, which includes sports, sometimes we tend to forget, the significance of what they brought and what we take from it when we watch our greatest, athletes, our greatest sports figures, perform, you know, in the ring or on the baseball field, football field, basketball court, whatever sport that you think you can think of. And when we sit back and reflect about all the great moments that we watch with our sports figures, we tend to forget how what we learn, what things that we learn from it, what we take from it, and also what are the things that we wanted to learn from. As we become older and become much more wiser in reflecting back into those memories. You know, for me, as a 28-year-old, unfortunately for me, I never saw, Marvin Hagler, in his prime. I've watched, old classic, boxing matches on ESPN Classic and obviously on YouTube because they're now easily accessible. But my first introduction to me, for me, for about Marvin Hagler was actually through a video game. Through the Fight Night, series that EA Sports used to do back in the day. I think it was Fight Night round. I think it was got to be round three, and Marvin Hagler was a playable character. And immediately I tried out Marvin Hagler, and I was very impressed of how his boxing ability, and not just his boxing ability alone, but his ability to take a shot and keep on coming. And this was a guy that really fought, with no quit whatsoever. This was a guy that you're gonna have to literally kill him, literally, to beat him. And when I was playing with them with my friends, during that video game, it was just, unreal. You could not knock this dude out. No matter how many times you hit him, he just kept on coming. He was never going to quit. And that was the type of figure that Marvin Hagler was throughout his entire boxing career. Um, Marvin Hagler was born in Massachusetts, okay? And what I didn't know about as I was, looking over about his boxing career, you know, he was brought into boxing by the streets. And then, you know, he taught himself how to be a boxer. And then one day, he walked into a gym owned by Pat and Goody Petronelli, who later on became his trainers and managers. you know, they basically helped him and showed them the ropes. And when he had the box, he had to lie about his age, due to the age restriction. And he made up that his birth year was 1954 instead of, you know, uh, I should say it was saying that he was born in 1952, but he was born in 1954. But when he started his amateur career, he won the National Golden Gloves in March of '73, and then later on 2 months later in that same year, he won the United States National Championship and compiled the 55-1 amateur record. Unfortunately, he wasn't ever selected to the Olympic boxing team that was highlighted by Sugar Ray Leonard, who had more of the mainstream appeal. Unfortunately, Marvin Hagler had to struggle through the ranks. He had to really struggle through the trenches to get where he wanted to be. And what Joe Frazier told Hagler one time is that you have three strikes against you. You're black, you're southpaw, and you're good. And literally, Hagler had to literally he had to travel, to his opponent's hometowns basically to get fights, and he had to basically go around the different areas of the globe to get fights and to make a name for himself. And the funny thing was that throughout the early stages of his career, during the most of the throughout the entire decade of the '70s, he was never given a title opportunity. He was devoid of a title opportunity because of the things that Joe Frazier talked about. And it wasn't until 1979 when literally he was given a title opportunity against Finito Antuomo. Okay, this was long into into the decade. Okay, and there's a little note there too, guys. There was actually a possible investigation that was going to happen between Top Rank and the FBI if Marvin Hagler didn't get his title shot. You want to talk about how corrupt boxing was? That means the epitome of it. And I wonder why hasn't Bob Arum gotten the same smug like all the other promoters have? Just a little side note about it, but we'll continue. So he got his first title shot at November 30th of 1979 against Finito Antuomo, and I watched the fight before doing this video, and I'm gonna tell you something. Marvin Hagler won that fight. He literally dominated against Antuomo that night and should have been the middleweight champion. But unfortunately, the judges screwed him over and called the fight a draw. And from that point forward, Marvin Hagler literally told to himself, from this point forward, my two fists are going to be my judges from here on out. He did not want to take the fight in the hands of the judges anymore. So after being screwed out of the middleweight titles, all right, he had to literally go all the way to the UK and face against Alan Minter, who just beat Finito El Tafomo for the same middleweight titles. And on April, uh, on September 27th of 1980, Marvin Hagler finally reached his moment of glory when he defeated Alan Minter in a third round TKO to become the undisputed middleweight champion. And this began the consecutive title defenses. He actually literally went through almost the entire '80s literally as the middleweight champion. He also pretty much was close to beating Carlo Monzon's, middleweight consecutive defenses of his middleweight title. He had 12, consecutive title defenses to this day, which is the third longest, unified title reign in the history of boxing at 6 years and 7 months. All right, and during that period of time, his nickname was basically Marvelous. But the media, as the sports media did not call him that way. So literally, he had to go to a courthouse and legally change his name to Marvin Nathaniel Hagler to basically the moniker Marvelous Marvin Hagler. That way, the media could not deny that name anymore. That was pretty much why. But he had legendary fights during that middleweight title reign. He had great fights with Roberto Duran, which was the only fight in that title reign that basically went the full 15 rounds. All right, and then you had the war between Thomas Hearns and Marvin Hagler. That first round, I'm gonna tell you something. I wish I was an adult watching that fight from the first round of the bell, because that fight was a bloodthirsty war from the moment the fight began. Both of them guys gave everything they had in that first round. It was an absolute war. All right, and literally Marvin Hagler's chin was shown in that fight because he took Thomas Hearns' best punches. Because remember, Thomas Hearns had one of the most devastating right hands in the history of boxing, not as a middleweight. And for Marvin Hagler to survive that round and take his right hand and basically shuck it off, it's just a testament of how durable Marvin Hagler was. In fact, it's been shown in records, all right, that he only had one knockdown throughout his entire career, which means that this guy had one of the strongest chins in all of boxing, literally. So Marvelous Marvin Hagler, survived the first round unscathed and literally was taking and started to take over the fight in the second round. But then he had the cut on the top of his forehead, and literally the fight was this close from being stopped. Thankfully, the ringside doctor didn't allow the fight to stop, and then ultimately Marvelous Marvin Hagler started taking over with vicious right hands and started pounding on Thomas Hearns, eventually knocking him out and having one of the biggest victories of his career. Then, after that fight, he had the legendary slugfest with John the Beast Mugabi, which by that time, John Mugabi had literally had 26 fights with 26 straight knockouts. All right. This was a man that was on a knockout feast. All right. Up until that night. And that fight's on YouTube, I think. But that fight, man, whew, that fight was one of the most brutal wars you'll ever find. Both of them guys literally gave everything they had, and they were both never the same. Especially for John Mugabe, because John Mugabe was literally a slugger as a middleweight. He had knocked out everybody until that night when he faced against Marvelous Marvin Hagler, a man that he basically couldn't bully and couldn't knock out. And literally, Sugar Ray Leonard was watching this fight because remember, Sugar Ray Leonard was briefly in retirement after going through the whole history with his eyesight. All right. And it was rumored by that time that, Sugar Ray Leonard wanted to face against Marvin Hagler. But in the first time when Sugar Ray Leonard announced his retirement, he pretty much said that the fight would never happen. And then afterwards, there was a lot of the ring around the rosy type of controversy about when the fight was ever going to take place. If the fight was ever going to happen, should I say. But after John Mugabe, was knocked out you know, uh, by Hagler, that I should say Sugar Ray Leonard, noticed, some of the slights of weaknesses, and pretty much said, "I can beat him. I want to take him." And then you had the legendary fight with Sugar Ray Leonard on April 6, 1987. And looking at back at that fight, it was pretty much a close fight either way. You could pretty much say that it could have went either way. There were some judges that felt like that Leonard was more of the aggressor and clean and basically, landed the more cleaner punches, but he landed in flurries. Then there were other judges who pretty much said that Hagler's body shots and aggression basically won him over the fight. Either way, it was pretty much a split decision. And unfortunately, Sugar Ray Leonard, won the fight by a very close decision. But unfortunately, you know, Marvin Hagler was so disgusted by the decision that he literally retired after the fight. Basically, pretty much confirming the thoughts in his mind that he was never going to get the full credit, that he was always going to get disrespected by the powers that be in boxing. And pretty much he never pursued for a rematch after that. Actually, let me take that back. He actually did pursue the rematch, but then Sugar Ray Leonard kept putting that off until the early '90s when there was rumored that Sugar Ray Leonard was indeed interested in a rematch, but by that time Hagler was already retired and he pretty much didn't want to take the rematch anymore. But you know, the one thing that I could take away from Hagler in terms of his great career was is that he was the type of guy that never gave up on himself. He was the type of fighter that no matter what the odds was stacked against him, he was never afraid of the big moment. And he always took a lot of the slightness against the media and used it as fuel. You know what I mean? He always felt that he was never given the full credit he deserved for being a great boxer he was. And absolutely, he's 100% right about that. The way that the media, disrespected him and never gave him his, just due, it really made you thinks about what are these guys doing in boxing and why are they coming to sport for? And I'm glad that we got, other platforms that are pretty much shedding the light of what really goes on in boxing and not following a lot of these mainstream guys that really don't know anything about boxing. But Marvelous Marvin Hagler had a Hall of Fame career, and to everybody else's opinions, and actually I'm going to say actual facts, he is the greatest middleweight boxer of all time. Some people had Bernard Hopkins as the greatest middleweight of all time. I did for a certain extent until obviously I got older and started to understand boxing a little bit more. But there's only a few middleweights that you could put in there, and Marvin Hagler is certainly at the top of the list. Don't ever mention Gennady Golovkin ever again, because Gennady Golovkin couldn't even scratch a lick to what Marvin Hagler did back in his heyday as the middleweight champion. But he was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame and the World Boxing Hall of Fame. He was also named a Fighter of the Decade in the 1980s by the Boxing Illustrated Media. Twice named the Fighter of the Year by Ring Magazine and the Boxers Writers Association in America in both 2001 and 2004. Ring Magazine named him the fourth greatest middleweight of all time and named him in 2002 as the 17th greatest fighter of the past 69 years. You know, me, Marvin Hagler was a guy that was always going to be slighted by the powers that be, but he never let that stop him in his pursuit of greatness. And that's certainly the thing that we're definitely going to miss the most. It's something that is lacking in a lot of these boxers here today. But he was a great boxer for his time, and certainly a lot of the boxing community is going to be very saddened about his passing. And that he's going to be definitely missed. You know what I mean? I'm certainly going to start watching a little bit more of his fights as we start celebrating the life of Marvin Hagler. But today, he passed away at the age of 66. But the memories that he created for the world of boxing will never be forgotten. And everything that he contributed to the sport, he did it with elegance and a grace and a certain level of bravery and also competitive spirit that can never ever be matched in boxing. So rest in peace, Marvin Hagler.